everyone. I'm Todd Keats, founder, CEO of My Care Friends.
And I'm Katie Seymour, VP of Programming and Community.
My Care Friends is proud to launch Global Caregiving Youth Collective, a new series shining a global light on young carers, voices too often unheard. The series features individuals who began caregiving in childhood and continue supporting loved ones today. Their lived experience and honesty shape every conversation.
Millions of young people provide meaningful care for family members, yet many remain unseen and unsupported. Through compassion and connection, My Care Friends hopes to build understanding and help create a future where young carers are truly seen and valued.
Follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook and watch each episode on the My Care Friends Network on YouTube. And now, Jacqueline, Omar, and Aditya, over to you.
Hello, everyone. To start, I just want to thank Todd and Katie. We're really excited to bring this important and special My Care Friends educational program to viewers wherever you are around the world. Caregiving is a responsibility that represents many challenges, and even more for people who have been young carers like us. We hope you'll join us for each episode, whether you are a young carer or someone who cares about a young carer. Today's episode is about emotional and mental health, and I'm one of your co-hosts, joined by my lovely friends Aditya and Jacqueline. I've been caring for my nana and uncle for almost up to 10 years until my senior year of high school, where I dealt with a lot of mental health issues. So this episode today is very important to me.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline. I'm 21 and I'm from Melbourne, Australia. I've grown up as a young carer caring for my twin brother and my older brother, who both have disabilities and a range of mental and physical health conditions. And then I also began caring for my mum when she was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2016.
Hi, I'm Aditya. I'm also one of the lovely co-hosts. Don't let the Chicago jumper fool you. I am a British bloke, purebred British. Um, and yeah, I'm 18 years old. I look after my younger brother with autism and ADHD, and I've been doing that for a while, about maybe 11 years now. And yeah, I think like Omar beautifully said, this is very important to all of us, and I think it's very important to every single carer or caregiver who exists and who has ever existed. So, very excited to hear from all of you today.
Yes, welcome to episode 2, you guys. Today, we're talking about something that doesn't really get discussed enough, the emotional and mental health side of caregiving youth. A lot of people, they focus on the physical tasks, this task that we do, but what really stays with you is the emotional weight. We become overwhelmed, burnt out. I guess we all know something about, being burnt out and, the guilt and the fear. And I want to be honest with you about something today. Just because we're here, as young adults now, in school, whether working or building our own lives, that doesn't mean that those feelings disappeared or even went away. Caregiving changes you, and today we're going to talk about that. To start, one of the hardest things of being a young caregiver youth is the emotional labor. You feel like you always have to be strong. I know for me, especially growing up as a black boy, they always would tell me, you always have to be strong. They would chastise me for even crying or even sharing my feelings. And I couldn't even, break down because I always had to be there for someone who needed me, like my loved ones, like my uncle and my nana. And even as a kid, I remember feeling tired in just so many ways. I felt tired for things that I didn't even have words for. I felt tired for going to school. I felt tired for even sleeping. I felt tired for cooking, tired for a lot of things. And also being tired, I felt guilt for wanting to break, guilt for wanting to hang out more with my friends, and guilt for even, just thinking about my own future. And I guess my question today is, for my lovely co-host, I want to ask you, when you were younger, and did you ever even realize that you were overwhelmed, or did it just feel normal at the time?
I think for me, it definitely felt normal, and I really relate to what you said about the expectation to be strong. Having two brothers with disability and growing up with a single parent, I really felt like there was an expectation for me to be strong for my mum. Like when I would say bye to family friends, or we'd had some sort of catch up and we were leaving, they'd be like, bye, be good for your mum, or your mum is so lucky to have you, to support her and to support my brothers. But that meant that I really felt like it was my responsibility, or like part of my identity, to be the good child or the easy child or the one that was sort of self-sacrificing to be there for my brothers and for my mum. And I think that was really hard as a young person because it sort of instilled it in me that that was my responsibility and made it hard to sort of be fun and have like be a bit reckless and things like that because I felt like I had to be strong and that emotional burden was something that it was my duty to carry rather than something that I was dealing with sort of due to my circumstances. It was sort of set to me as an expectation.
Yes, I agree. It's kind of hard to explain, unless you lived it. Aditya, what did burnout for you look like as a kid?
My experience with mental health and sort of emotion with caring is quite different, I would say, because and I definitely think probably not. Well, I don't know if it's unique or not. I've never really felt proper emotional. I've never really. I don't think I've ever been pushed to the point of emotional breakdown. Um, I think for the most part, I've always been very numb. I think it just became so integrated into my lifestyle that it just like I just stopped feeling an emotion. And I think that definitely has transferred to other parts of my life where, I think I would describe myself as perhaps not being the most emotional person just in general. Um, and I think maybe it's because I'm still quite young that I haven't actually that actually hasn't sort of built up and pushed me to that point of breakdown yet. And I think it depends. I think different situations and different circumstances and events in the future will might end up pushing me to that, and I have to be prepared when I do reach that. But I think whenever I do sort of feel slightly off balance with my mental health, it's not necessarily, well, the main one is it comes from anxiety about the future of my brother because I don't have much family other than, so I don't have any family other than really just myself and yeah, my brother and my parents, which even that, I'm quite grateful for because I know a lot of people didn't grow up with that. But it's about looking in the future and thinking, how is he going to cope? How is he going to survive? But then the second source of, I guess, issues surrounding my mental health sometimes arise from the implications. For example, not being able to see my friends or just having that mental barrier that sort of stops me from meeting people because I always feel like I should be at home instead of going out. Um, so I think mine's quite different, but I think still it's probably going to take some time to manifest over time. But yeah, I think for the whole part, I'm quite numb about it.
I definitely relate to the feeling of worrying about the future. I sort of feel like with being a secondary carer a lot of the time in my family with my mum as the primary caregiver, when my mum's not around to support my brothers, I feel like that'll automatically become my responsibility. And as a young carer, I feel like that makes me feel like I have a time limit on my youth and how much time I have to travel and do things that I enjoy because then I feel like I'll have to sort of clock in to be the primary caregiver for my brothers when my mum's not around. And I feel like having that sort of looming over you as an expectation in the future really plays on your mind when you're making decisions about where to study or can I move away from my family? Like, can I move interstate or overseas? Can I go on exchange? That's something I'm definitely thinking about at the moment. And like in theory, I don't want to be worrying about that. I trust that my family will be okay and I can be there for them, like wherever I am geographically. But it does always play in the back of my mind, like, how long do I have until I'm sort of tied down with my caring responsibilities?
Yes, I totally agree with you, Jacqueline. I remember at a young age, I actually learned mental health issues from my mother. Because at times I would often mimic her, what she did. When she was depressed, I got depressed. When she cried, I cried. And at times when you're a kid, you sort of like mimic what your parents do. So doing that it made me become very depressed because seeing that the people that you love and being put in this position, like my uncle, he was paralyzed. My nana, she couldn't really provide for him. So we were going through like a lot of things. We were going through moving from home to home. I was going through being bullied. I was just going through all of these things, and it just put me into like this depressive state. So looking back on it, I wanted to ask you guys, what's one thing you wish someone had told you about taking care of your own mental health? Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, I think probably don't be too hard on yourself. One thing that I definitely still have is to a large extent is this. I'm just going to say it plainly, is self-hatred. I think that is, I do have a lot of self-criticism, and I think anybody who's been thrust into a responsibility, a caring responsibility very early on, will have that because you're suddenly holding yourself to expect to standards of what is usually like an adult or sort of a grown-up who's matured and who's seen life and who's paid taxes. But I think yeah, don't be too hard on yourself, because that is at times, see, for me, for example, I often really worry about how can I support my brother like financially, or how can I, look after him? How can I give him the right resources? How can I give him the right care? Like, how do I get the right help? And sometimes I feel that I'm kind of lacking behind, if that makes sense. Sometimes I feel that I'm not doing enough to set myself up for the future, and that often leads to spirals of just like, I'm not really doing anything. And I think just taking a day at a time, just stopping, just taking a second to breathe, and just taking a day at a time, solving the problems that come a day at a time, and not really thinking about sort of what's happening tomorrow, but just thinking about what's happening right now, because um, life will kick you in your nether regions where like every single day, and at the most unexpected times, and if you're not present, you won't be able to solve the problems that you're currently facing. Um, and I think, yeah, just be present, take a day at a time, and don't be too harsh on yourself. That's probably what I'm going to say.
I love that. What
Absolutely.
about you, Jacqueline?
I would say for me, it's giving myself permission to feel the feelings that come with my caring role. I think often as like a secondary carer in a family with my mum having the primary caregiving role for my brothers, it felt like what I was doing wasn't significant enough, or I wasn't, there for the most traumatic events, or if I was there for traumatic events with like medical emergencies or incidents with my brother's safety, once they were under control, then, another adult would come and take me, to their house or something if I couldn't go home with my mum. So while I was partly shielded from it, it did really have a big impact on me. And I think that in that sense, it's hard to like give yourself permission to be anxious or to be sad because you feel like it's not valid for you to have those emotions. So I think it's really important to acknowledge, like for me, I often felt on edge, like something sort of impending doom that something was going to go wrong because often there were medical crises or one of my brothers would be really unwell or escalated, there would be sort of an incident. And I often was told by like school counselors or psychologists, people who were really well meaning and trying to help me to think about, is that in your control? What's in your control versus what's out of your control? And my family members' health and how they're doing in life isn't directly in my control. Like I can support them through my caring role and how I look after them. But whether or not they have a crisis in the middle of the day while I'm at school and I have to be picked up or something like that isn't in my control. But just because it's outside of my control, I don't think it's realistic to expect young carers to not be impacted by that. And I think that advice is well meaning to be like, well, don't worry about it. You're just a kid. It's your parents' responsibility. But in reality, that does really weigh on you. And it's okay to feel those feelings of, fear and helplessness and anxiety about what could be going on with your family.
Yes, I love that you touched on that topic because while caring for my loved ones, mental health issues, it was brought up a lot, especially in my household. My advice to other young carers would be to put yourself first at sometimes because I learned that putting myself first, they helped me a lot in terms of like, maybe cook your meals first for yourself instead of, your loved ones, maybe go outside for a walk, listen to music, draw, or just do something that you really love, or take passion in doing that because I want you to know that your mental health is important and you belong to be here. And just because you're a young carer, you don't have to let that define who you are. And I'm glad that we all touched on these topics and advice, which leading me to talk about watching someone you love struggle. So I know that for one of the hardest things was for me was feeling powerless. When you're young, you don't have control over doctors, money, or even big decision, I would say. But you still feel responsible for some of that. If you guys understand what I'm talking about, you want to fix things that you can't fix, and that can make you feel scared and helpless, even if you don't say it out loud. My question to you guys is, how did it feel emotionally to watch your loved one struggle?
Yeah, well, I think there have been loads of different instances just with the nature of my brother's disability, how he struggles sort of differs from day to day. And I can think of quite a lot of examples off the top of my head, things that I think, you know, are I'll just put it quite traumatic to go back to. But I think oftentimes because of his inability to express, it always resorts to like this really pained, wretched screaming. And you can basically hear his soul just shatter while to the screams. That was something that happened recently during, I think, whilst they were trying to give him an injection. I think he just didn't understand what that was about. And so I just remember we had about five people just trying to pin him down, myself included, just pinning him down. He had no clue. He just thought he thought he was being kidnapped. He thought he was being attacked. And I was just like, it's just a dentist. But he, he didn't understand the situation. He didn't know how to sort of position himself. It was a complete chaos. And in that time when he was screaming a lot, I think, yeah, it completely broke me. And I think that was the first time I actually was like properly close to crying. And that was the first time in like a really, really long time. Um, because it's just you've just seen someone that you look after go through pain, and in a way you kind of feel a bit of guilt, even though it's not your fault, because you think that it's because for me, I know it's my primary responsibility to look after and make sure he's happy at all times. But now I've just seen him there, sort of writhing around and screaming. Like I just feel, it can make you feel quite guilty, and it can also just again sort of bring myself back to thoughts about future anxiety to think, well, if I can't handle this, what about in the future when something really bad happens? How am I going to manage then? Um, yeah, and in terms of coping, that's something that I'm yet to figure out. Um, but yeah, time will tell.
I definitely relate to what Aditya said. I think for me, ensuring the safety of the people I care for often means something that they don't like. Sometimes health and safety isn't enjoyable for things like going to the dentist, or if my brothers were having a medical crisis and there were emergency services involved, no one wants to be talking to the police, no one wants to be talking to paramedics from the ambulance. But sometimes that is the only way to stop them from being a danger to themselves or to others. And it feels like you are inflicting pain by being a part of that. And I totally understand what Aditya said about, feeling guilty and watching someone be really distraught in front of you, but not being able to intervene because even though that's such an unpleasant and really traumatic experience for them, it's the safest option. Sometimes you do have to have emergency services intervention in order to keep everyone safe, but it is very confronting to watch. And I know for me, I also feel like I'm always mentally monitoring my brother's medical conditions and sort of worrying about how that'll affect them in the future and whether it'll shorten their lifespans or if they'll be, yeah, sicker in the future and whether or not I'll be able to cope with that. And I feel like there sort of is a bit of anticipatory grief about, what will life be like in, a decade or something like that when their health may have deteriorated, or also grieving the childhood that we didn't have together. One of my brothers grew up in out of home care for his disability, so we weren't always living in the same place. And having a twin brother, there's often this cliche that you're so close, you're like connected at the hip. Twins can like mind read each other, like, little I don't know, things like that about the connection for twins. And that was not my experience at all. So, sort of grieving the childhood that we didn't have that I'd seen depicted in media or, other twins that I know. But then also the anticipatory grief of like, what will life be like when, things could be worse in the future. But then knowing that we don't have a crystal ball, we don't know what it will be like. So, really trying to be present and enjoy things as they are. But it can be hard when you're worried about the future.
Yes, it really can be hard. And I just want to thank you guys for being open and vulnerable about talking about that. My uncle, he also, my uncle, he was very angry at times toward me. Like he would often, hit me or at times, spit at me. And things like that. And these are like just things that young carers they go through. He hit at me. He would just do these things that often made me feel sad. I felt guilty because the things that he was doing, he didn't have control over because he had autism. He didn't know the things that what he was doing was affecting me. He didn't know that he was abusing me. He didn't know that he was doing all of these things towards me. And that made me feel really sad. And it did put me into an emotional state. And it did make me also like isolate myself in a sort of way, which made me be lonely for a certain point. And talking about loneliness, I know that in the United States, a big part of loneliness is that nobody even asks. You know, teachers didn't know, friends didn't understand about us, and there was no form to check in on us, no counselors checking in on us. So a lot of us just stayed quiet. And like Aditya said, loneliness isn't, just about being alone. It's often about feeling, unseen. And I want to ask you guys, did your friends at school know you were a caregiver, or did you keep that part of your life sort of like hidden in a way?
So I've always been quite open about my caregiving responsibilities just because I've never felt sort of ashamed because I was recognized as a carer at a very young age, and I've always been sort of very vocal about it. I've never had an emotional attachment to it. I never really felt like this was an embarrassing thing at a surface level. But where I think sometimes the isolation does hit is in those situations. We were just talking about watching a loved one struggle. When you watch someone that you love struggle, and then as a result, your family struggling along with it, very, very difficult to kind of be vulnerable to people that you're close with and really just explain what you've been through. I know I gave a very minor, trivial example about just something like just my brother in the hospital. There have been cases where I've nearly lost him, right? And there have been these near death accidents, there are these severe injuries, um, which I'm not afraid to talk about, just sort of saying this happened. But when it comes to actually explaining what I went through, and because I've just seen him there and he couldn't, he doesn't even know what he's been through, but I'm just sitting here as a young man. And it's very difficult for me to explain even to my parents what I've just been through. And I think in that situation, like we could just forget about oh, I don't have enough time to meet my friends. Just looking at those situations, I think is enough to really sort of show how at times isolated and how helpless you can be. Because I know, even I think Omar, you're probably aware of this slight digression, that male loneliness in and of itself is already a big issue, especially for young men, and it's also rising for women as well. And I think when you've already got that sort of just not being able to talk to other people about what you're going through, and now you've got this sort of layer of complexity of like, well, this is my caring situation. Yeah, it can be quite. It's a bit. It's weird. That's what I'll say. That's how I'll describe it for now.
Speaking on what Aditya said, what made it hardest for you to open up about what you was going through?
I think for me, I definitely relate to what Aditya said, is it's really hard to sort of convey the significance of these events when you're a young person. And to your question, Omar, the thing that made it hardest for me to share or be open about my caring role is that I didn't want to feel like a burden to others. And when people say like, "Hey, how are you? How are your summer holidays?" to sort of trauma dump on them, as it's now sort of been coined, to share all the traumatic things you've been through is not the response that anyone's looking for. And I think people don't want to be seen to always be struggling, like, oh, I'm having, a crisis in my family yet again. And when people ask you, how's your day? If something really traumatic happened, like someone I love was suicidal or self-harming, or like Aditya said, you really were worried that you were going to lose someone that you love, like that's so complex to go into that it's almost just too hard. Like it's not worth bothering. And I think it makes other people feel uncomfortable when you like unload something like that onto them. And when you have such consistent like crises and traumas occurring in your family, people can't really deal with the emotional toll of that always being your response. Like always saying something really scary is happening with my brother, or, it's an intense time, or he's not doing so well. So you sort of just say, oh, yeah, like it's a bit tough for them, but, I'm at uni and I'm just starting back for the semester, and you sort of pivot because you don't want to make that person uncomfortable and it's too hard to go into. So I think the loneliness for me was about like feeling unseen and feeling like I was carrying so much that other people weren't carrying because it was just too hard to like convey to them what that was like as a young carer.
I will just interject, sorry, Omar, um, because I think, we speak a lot about this. Um, but I do want to take this as an opportunity to kind of just reflect on something kind of positive that I've experienced. Just going to keep it completely honest, which is that when I was younger and I asked, and I really, really wanted a brother, um, I wanted a companion, I wanted a friend to play with. And when I realized that that wasn't, it wasn't going to be the typical sort of brotherhood relationship, I was quite disappointed. But then actually over time, as I've realized sort of that isol whilst I do feel like I've been isolated sort of emotionally from other people, it's actually brought me a lot closer to my family and to my brother, and actually a lot closer than I think. A lot closer. I'm a lot closer to him than I would have been had it been neurotypical, I think. Um, and so I see that as kind of like a, I wouldn't necessarily say it. Yeah, I'll call it a benefit, honestly. I think that's the silver lining that I'm going to take from it. And whilst I have lost out on perhaps a lot of other social connections, social interactions, I've definitely become a lot closer to my family. And in a way, that's kind of making up for the isolation. Now I get to see him evolve, going from, a young person, like a small, fat baby, to just a big, fat baby. But, those are sort of my little positivity, my little glimpse of positivity.
Yes, I love that the fact that you touched on the family dynamic of it because even though I did become sad, when my uncle passed away my senior year of high school because I felt like, well, what do I have left? What can I do now? Like now that my caregiving duties have ended, what's my next option? Like Aditya said, I am open about certain things. I'm open about suicidal. I did become suicidal at a very young age because of what I was going through. I didn't necessarily want to, do that to myself. I wanted the pain to stop. I wanted it, I wanted to like feel less alone. And I just wanted to everything to just, be normal for once. I wanted to have a normal childhood. I wanted to, ride my bicycle outside with my friends. I wanted to do something, but I just really couldn't do it. I just felt alone. I just felt really sad. Which brings me to the topic of asking about what advice would you give a young carer listening who feels completely alone right now?
I would say it's really important to try and connect with community. I think for me, that's been the thing that's really helped in my caring role is finding out that I was a young carer and identifying with that term so that I could meet other young carers and caregiving youth. And I think this podcast is the perfect example. Like Aditya's in the UK, Omar's in the US. Like when would I have ever met these other two young carers in any other circumstance? Like, I haven't even been to the UK, so, I haven't met Aditya in person. So it's such a lovely connection to hear your stories and to feel like there's so much commonality and things that I relate to so deeply in your stories, even though we've grown up on different sides of the world. And I think that's why it's important to recognize young carers so that you can explain your caring role and meet other people who are in similar positions. So if you do have a friend who's a young carer, or if you have someone who has someone with a disability in their family, I think those friendships are really important because you don't have to sort of explain it or be worried about being a burden or sort of tiptoe around the traumatic events like I was talking about before because these people just get it. Like that's their reality too. Even though it might look different, the context is different in their family, who they care for, what sort of care they provide. But I think really leaning into a community of young people who get it. And also you can learn from them, like seeing young carers go to university and sort of navigate adjustments that they might need at university really helped me to know how I would manage it. And then, entering the workforce or navigating moving out of home, like seeing the way that they manage their caring role and the way their caring role changes over time really gives me hope and confidence that I can sort of deal with all those transitions too.
Honestly, I don't really know. I don't really know how to answer that because I think it depends on it's a very depends on the individual. I think one thing though, I'm not sure whether this will answer the question or not, is that I think this whole narrative of sort of talking more, whilst it is important, I think it's also coming from people who don't actually have lived experience. And it's very easy to say talk more, be open, sort of reach out. But for a lot of people, like I would say I'm definitely fortunate enough that I have that confidence to speak about it. But for a lot of people, it's a lot harder. And so I think just, yeah, I think just looking at back, I think it really depends on who you are. But just trying to stay comfortable and just, like I keep saying, just sort of not hating, not being too harsh on yourself, I think will always be the answer to any question. To any situation. It's just not being too harsh on yourself, um, and just taking every day as it comes. And for me, interacting with other young carers over my life, uh, I think it's made me lot more grateful. Um, like I said, I'm so happy that yeah, I even have a brother. Like I get to interact with him, and it's brought me a lot closer to him. And I think just being really grateful for those small things every single day. Like every time he says a sentence of more than 3 or 4 words, that's a huge win. Right? That's a celebration. That's a mini celebration in and of itself. So I just think treasuring every moment and not being too harsh on yourself. I'm not sure if that's answered the question, but
Yes, I think you answered that perfectly, actually. And for me, I just want to say that when I was younger, I wish I would have allowed myself to admit that I needed help. So I'd say asking for help is something that you could also do. I thought being strong meant handling everything alone. But now that I'm here, a senior at NYU, now that I know asking for support is part of being strong. And I would like to say, and if this episode makes you feel less alone in this world, I want you to hear this. You're not broken and you're not responsible for wanting to feel something real. I just want to thank my lovely co-host here today for being vulnerable and being open and to share about these issues of mental health because talking about it is very important. And I want people out there in the world to know that young carers, we are really going through something and we want to be seen. And for our next episode, next time, we'll be exploring how caregiving can interrupt childhood shaping roles, responsibilities, and identity in many ways few people see. That's episode 3, Childhood Interrupted. Thank you guys for being here today. I hope you have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank
thank you.
you.